I'm going to introduce our speaker now. It's a serious honor for me to be able to introduce my former PhD advisor. Yes, it really is. He earned his PhD in special education from the University of Washington in 1991 and has been a faculty member at Utah State University since. He has 25, 30 years of experience teaching reading, and he has interests in evidence-based practice and school-wide reading instruction. In addition, and this is why he's so important to me, he's a fantastic mentor and teacher. In 2011, he was the Teacher of the Year for Utah State's College of Education, and in the same year, he also received the Fred S. Keller Behavioral Education Award from Division 25 of the American Psychological Association. So it's not just me who thinks he's an amazing teacher and mentor. In the past few years, Dr. Slocum has published 7 articles or book chapters and presented 13 papers or workshops on topics related to evidence-based practice. Keep in mind, too, that when my professor in 2006 discouraged me from doing this, it was not Dr. Slocum, okay? It was not him. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for him, I probably would have, eventually spun out because I didn't get the answers I wanted. And he's probably going to tell you a little bit more, but he's been so influential and so powerful in the development of my scholarship and my understanding about evidence-based practice. I'm just so excited for him to be able to share that with you today. Tim Slocum.
I'm not returning that call. I'm just setting a timer here. Well, thanks, Trina. It's great to be here. It's great to see such a diverse audience of people who are interested in evidence-based practice. I have to say a little something about how advising Trina in her doc program really took advantage of some of my strongest skills that I'm very proud of, which is finding smart people and getting out of the way and letting them do great things. And that was pretty much my advising strategy with Trina. As she said, I've been in education and special education and working with people with disabilities for over 30 years now, and I'm still really excited about it. I still think it's an amazing thing to do, and what a wonderful way to spend a career in something that's really meaningful to me. And I think it's really important to touch back in with that, because it's easy, to get lost in the daily stuff of doing our jobs, doing our routines, making the machine work. And sometimes forgetting how important it is to do the work we're doing and to do it really, really well. The things that got us into it in the first place, just the incredible importance in the lives of the people we work with. What a difference it makes between doing this kind of in an okay, got through, nobody got mad at me, we didn't get sued kind of way, versus really doing it, at a very high level and changing lives. So I always, like I said, like to start with that touchstone, whether it's in a class or in thinking about what I want to say to a group like this. And because this audience is so diverse, there's no particular word I can use here. So I'm going to say education, but those of you who are in adult services or are in preschool kinds of stuff, I'm sure you can translate. I really am thinking more inclusively about all kinds of disability services. But throughout here, it's going to say education and teachers and stuff. But I think the points are across. Anyway, the outcomes from the kind of work we do are too important to leave to chance. Just kind of doing stuff and stumbling upon things that work sometimes and not finding out about things that could have worked other times is just not good enough because of the importance of what we do. Because our success or failure in our work has real lifelong impacts on our students and our clients, the people we work with, and society as a whole. I mean, we are all in it together. I'm thinking here about the way we treat people with disabilities is a microcosm of the way we treat everybody in society, the way we think about people who are different. And we're all different in various ways. And then when we talk about education, there's lots of publicity about we're competing in a world economy. And what our country's going to look like in 20 years depends a lot on the quality of education right now. Because if we're not competing for being the location of Google and Microsoft and companies like that, then we're competing to make shirts. And that's a whole different kind of society. And I think our outcomes in education and other areas are not as good as they could be. I think we all know that. I mean, all of us are in the field. We know, what goes on every day. I know about my own work. And in the field of education, we have international comparisons. Very frequently, we read in the paper about, the educational outcomes in reading and math and other areas for kids in the United States versus kids in other countries. And we're not at the top. We are well down in those things. A lot of countries that are shocking are producing better outcomes with their kids. And the NAEP every year comes out, and year after year we see it more or less flat in terms of the educational outcomes for kind of median kids across the board. And we see different groups not doing as well. Of course, we see kids with disabilities, kids who are diverse in a lot of different dimensions, not doing as well. And although there's blips up and there's blips down, that's not changing a lot. It's not changing in a massive way. And as I mentioned, our own inside knowledge of the systems we work in. I could take my department as an example. I think we do a good job, but we could do better. We could step up more. And so in thinking about that, I want to emphasize what I think is maybe the most important problem-solving principle is focus on what you can control. When problem solving, I think it's disastrous to start focusing on variables that we can't control, that are too large or manipulated by other people. But if we can focus on what we can control, then we can actually make a difference. And if people in all the various roles in here focus on the variables they can control, the entire system can pivot. And what can we as educators and other people working with people with disabilities, what can we control? Well, one thing we can control is our selection and implementation of treatments or educational programs or strategies, tactics, interventions we use with our clients and in our agencies and in our schools. And how we conduct our professional practice. That's what we really control to a great degree. How we go about what we do every day in whatever role we're in here. What we choose to do. And in all these areas, there's a research to practice gap. There's a huge body of research demonstrating what educational practices are more and less effective. And these things are not systematically applied to educational practice. They're spotty. There's places where people are doing an excellent job in applying those, and there's a lot of places where all the educational research, all the disability research that's ever been done really doesn't impact practice very much. And I think that evidence-based practice, the reason I've been really working in that area for a number of years is because I think that may be part of a solution. This is an old problem, a problem a lot of people have banged their head against, this research to practice problem. But I think evidence-based practice gives us a model for integrating research into a larger process of decision-making for education and other areas. And I think there's reasons for optimism about evidence-based practice. There are reasons it might not actually just be a fad, just be the thing, the flavor of this half decade and then go away, and people said, oh, we tried that, it didn't work. One thing is that it's been very effective in other professions, and I'm going to talk in a minute about some of the other professions where evidence-based practice has really taken hold and really reshaped the way people do things. The other thing about having been effective in other professions is evidence-based practice is a language and a set of ideas that allow us to communicate across professions and allow us to share ideas. Trina kind of mentioned this. Evidence-based practice really has broad bipartisan political support. A lot of the structures that support evidence-based practice were actually put in place in the Bush administration. And as Trina read parts of that memo from somebody in the Obama administration, you could hardly have stronger support for the general approach of evidence-based practice. And these days, you know, if somebody's got bipartisan support, that's pretty special. I think they haven't noticed yet, because somebody's got to oppose it. And the other thing is it's already, evidence-based practice is already strongly supported in federal education legislation, in both the current version of IDEA and the Elementary and Secondary Act. It's structured in. So there's a lot of things, both in terms of the structure, the legal structure, the political structure of education and disabilities, as well as the kind of professional momentum to it, that makes me think this might actually have an impact. So my goals for the session is to start off with defining evidence-based practice. And you know, I am a professor, and so you got to start off with defining terms and things like that. But I think there's even a better reason for doing that. I think it's very important to get very clear on what we mean by evidence-based practice, because I think there's a lot of ways it can be misinterpreted and kind of go off the tracks. And if that happens, I think we miss a tremendous opportunity, and we might even create something with the name evidence-based practice that undermines good, high-quality services. I think it's something that, if done in a not very thoughtful way, could actually be damaging. So I think it's going to be very important to be really clear on what we mean by this and how it affects our problem solving. So I'm going to spend some time on defining it, even though everybody's heard the term 1,000 times and probably used the term 1,000 times. I think that'll be worthwhile. And then I want to describe the components of evidence-based practice. And finally, discuss evidence-based practice as a framework for decision-making, for professional decision-making. So that's the... So the origins of evidence-based practice was in medicine. In the 1960s, especially in England and to some extent in the United States, people started to recognize that there was this tremendous research to practice gap. We always think of medicine as being way, way ahead of us, and they've got scientists on their side. And studies revealed that like 10 to 25% of medical treatment decisions were actually based on high quality of evidence, which is rather shocking. It raises the question of, okay, how are you going to make those other decisions, the non-evidence ones? And this was actually, numerous studies kind of showed this kind of thing. And again, I want to go back to, it's easy to think, oh, wow, this is medicine, so not making decisions based on the very best possible evidence, that's outrageous. That cannot continue. I want to argue that in our field, it's equally important. You know, our outcomes are that important if we reflect back on why we're in the area. So, going back to medicine, a definition that developed in medicine of evidence-based practice, evidence-based medicine, is the integration of the best research evidence with clinical expertise and patient values. And that's a sort of definition that's been repeated by many people in medicine. Sackett is the primary person who's done a lot of the writing in this area. The United States Institute of Medicine has adopted a very, very similar definition. So there's a three-part definition here. It's the best research evidence, and that's kind of the point of the whole thing, is to bring that into the decision-making process. But it's still a decision-making process that includes clinical expertise and patient values. And then to explore a little bit each of those three components. What they mean in medicine by the best available external clinical evidence is clinically relevant research. Evidence-based medicine is not restricted to randomized trials and meta-analyses. So in medicine, they're saying, look, we want to get the best of what's available to help us make effective decisions for our patients. We're not going to limit ourselves to only randomized trials and only the very kind of highest possible level of evidence. But we want to get the best of what's available for every decision we make. It involves tracking down the best external evidence with which to answer our clinical questions. If no randomized trial has been carried out for our patient's predicament, we must follow the trail to the next best external evidence and work from there. Right? It doesn't really make sense at some point to say, oh, the very best possible kind of evidence is not available, therefore, we're just going to make a decision based on intuition or something. And what do they mean by clinical expertise? They mean proficiency in judgment that individual clinicians acquire through clinical experience and clinical practice. And it's reflected in effective and efficient diagnosis. So when we think about how this might relate to our fields in disabilities, the importance of the practitioner's ability to effectively and efficiently diagnose a problem, and thoughtful identification and compassionate use of individual patients' predicaments, rights, and preferences in making clinical decisions about their care. So right in here, in this original medical definition of evidence-based practice, includes the practitioner being smart and wise about how they're using evidence to solve problems for people, for their patients. It's not cookbook medicine because it requires a bottom-up approach that integrates the best external evidence with individual clinical expertise and patient choice. It cannot result in slavish cookbook approaches to individual patient care. So it's definitely not a kind of one-size-fits-all, this is the approved thing you have to do, no matter what the nature of your patient is. It's very, very far from that. External evidence can inform, but can never replace individual clinical expertise. It's this expertise that decides whether the external evidence applies to an individual case, and if so, how it should be integrated. So that's where it started in medicine, with that kind of a sense of it's a problem-solving process that includes the best available evidence. And then in psychology, moving a little closer to our area, the American Psychological Association grappled with this and came up with actually an official statement of the APA on evidence-based practice in psychology. Evidence-based practice in psychology is the integration of the best available research with clinical expertise in the context of patient characteristics, cultures, and preferences. So a very similar structure to the definition. And they make an important distinction between evidence-based practice and empirically supported treatments. And this is something that's gotten kind of confused in the education world. Evidence-based practice starts with the patient and asks, what research evidence will assist the psychologist in achieving the best outcome? It's a decision-making process for integrating research evidence into the intervention process. Versus empirically supported treatments, that starts with a treatment and asks, does this treatment have sufficient research support to be used? And so psychological treatments that have been shown to be efficacious in clinical trials are termed empirically supported treatments. So we've got these two things. One is a problem-solving process that includes the best available evidence. And the other is a set of treatments that are known through research to be effective. And you see how those can work together. So what do they think in psychology is the best research evidence? Scientific results related to intervention strategies. Multiple research designs can contribute to this. So they talk about meta-analyses being the very highest level of evidence, and randomized controlled trials, effectiveness research, and a whole wide variety of different kinds of research, including single case experiments, all the way down to clinical observations. So in psychology, like medicine, they're looking at an entire continuum of possible sources of evidence with very high quality randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses of such things at the top. But if we don't have that kind of evidence, then we go down the scale. And what do they mean by clinical expertise? They say this is essential for identifying and integrating the best research evidence with clinical data. They include in that things like assessment, diagnosis, diagnostic judgment, treatment planning, clinical decision-making, interpersonal expertise, self-reflection, use of research evidence, understanding individual and cultural differences, seeking resources, having cogent rationale for clinical strategies. So clinical expertise is this very complex, broad area that's necessary to use the best available evidence and bring it to bear on individual cases and patient characteristics, culture, and preferences. APA says normative data on what works for whom, that's overall research data, provide essential guides to effective practice. Nevertheless, psychological services are most likely to be effective when they're responsive to the patient's specific problems, strengths, personality, social, cultural context, and preferences. So there's a lot of emphasis here on making the research evidence work in the particular case. And this involves a consideration of the patient's values and so on. Just to quickly touch a few other professions that have formally defined evidence-based practice. The term, according to ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Association, the term evidence-based practice refers to an approach in which current high-quality research is integrated with practitioner expertise and client preferences and values into a process of making clinical decisions. So a very similar kind of definition. The National Autism Center, I'm going to just quickly go through this, basically has a very similar definition of evidence-based practice. Involves the research base as well as clinical expertise and takes into account individual situations. In education, Russ Whitehurst, who was the first director of the Institute for Educational Sciences, described evidence-based education as the integration of professional wisdom with the best available empirical evidence. So once again, very similar approach. Whitehurst addressed, why are both of these things needed? He said, without professional wisdom, education can't adapt to local circumstances and can't operate intelligently in the many areas where research evidence is absent or incomplete. And he really surfaced that in an important way, that in a lot of the decisions we make, there is not a huge amount of research just waiting to be used on exactly the predicament we're engaged with. There's some evidence of varying quality that's somehow related. That's one place where professional expertise is needed. However, without empirical evidence, education can't resolve competing approaches, generate cumulative knowledge, avoid fad, fancy, and personal bias. So, as I've kind of been emphasizing through all these professions, the definition of evidence-based practice has those three components. And there's an alternative meaning, especially in education. We hear about evidence-based practice being talked about in terms of practices that have been shown to be effective by credible research, that kind of thing. Is this an evidence-based practice, or is it not an evidence-based practice? Or we want a list of what are the evidence-based practices. And again, that's a different meaning. That's more like what psychology would call empirically supported treatments. And it's different than this problem-solving process that we're talking about. And what this turns on is two different meanings of the word practice. Practice can mean a specific activity, as in when we talk about best practices. Right? Then practice is something you do, a practice. Right? And that leads to a definition of an intervention that's been found to have strong research support. A different meaning of practice is the sense that a lawyer has a law practice, or a doctor has their medical practice. And in that sense, it's all of their professional duties, right? Everything they do as a lawyer or as a doctor is their practice, And that's the sense in which evidence-based practice has been defined in other fields, and that's where we get the decision-making process. So again, there's two senses of this word practice. One is a particular activity, and the other is the whole of our professional activities. And I think it's important to go with that broad definition, because I think what we need here is to promote and support a pervasive use of evidence in educational decision-making for people with disabilities. That it's not good enough to just use evidence on those few decisions where there's really, really definitive, empirically supported treatments. That to really do the job for our clients and our students, we need to apply evidence everywhere. We need to look for a much broader range of evidence. So the effective use of scientific research requires professional expertise and consideration of context. If we ignore this, we're bound to fail, and evidence-based practice will be another fad that comes and goes, because it won't work. Right? Ignoring the role of professional decision-making and ignoring the fact that our clients are individuals and that any treatments that we use have to be considered for that individual simply won't get the job done for us. So I'm going to suggest, probably not surprisingly, that evidence-based practice in education and in disability disciplines is a decision-making process that integrates these three things: best available evidence, professional judgment, client values, and context. However, at the same time, it's very important to recognize what are the things, what are the treatments that have good research support. So like psychology, I think we should use the term empirically supported treatment for that. And so empirically supported treatments are an important component of evidence-based practice, but evidence-based practice is much broader. So the components, I'm going to explore a little bit the best available evidence. And I think that's really a term that the medical profession came up with, which is a great term, because it implies a continuum of quality of evidence. It says the best available. It doesn't just say only excellent evidence is all we're interested in. It's saying for any predicament, for any question, we want to know what's the best that's available. And so that suggests a continuum of quality of evidence, of bestness. And so one aspect of that continuum is certainty. That is the research really, really good methodologically? And is there a lot of it? And another dimension of this is relevance. Evidence is better if it's very relevant to the question I'm asking. So if it's done with clients or patients who are very similar to mine, if it's in a context that's similar to mine, and so on. So that's a second dimension of of quality, of bestness. And so the idea is decisions should be made based on the best of what's available. That's different from considering only very high quality of evidence. And so empirically supported treatments are part of the answer, an important part. But practitioners also need recommendations on all the other decisions they make that don't have empirically supported treatments as a solution, right? That empirically supported treatments are not available. It's not good enough for us researchers to say, well, you have an educational problem or a problem with a student with disabilities. We just need to do more research. That doesn't solve the immediate problem. So evidence-based practice has to be broader than that. So here's my little conceptual graph of the best available evidence. Down along the bottom, we've got relevance. So some evidence might be highly relevant to our particular situation. The PTOC means participants, treatments, outcomes, and contexts. In all those ways, a research study might be similar to what I'm grappling with, or it might be different from what I'm grappling with. So evidence is better if it's over on the right side, because it's more highly relevant. And then we have quality, which is the one that most people think about first when we talk about, how good is the evidence. From uncontrolled observations down on the low side to multiple formal studies up on the high side, randomized controlled studies. So as we go to the upper right, we get better and better evidence. And way up there is a beautiful cloud of empirically supported treatments. So when there's a whole bunch of studies that are highly relevant to my issues, to the problems I'm trying to solve, and they're high quality, well, happy day. Because then we can find an empirically supported treatment that is applicable to what I need to do. Right? And so that's where empirically supported treatments become a very important part of evidence-based practice. But sometimes there isn't an empirically supported treatment for our issue. Right? There's not a lot of research that's been done that's very relevant to the particular situation I'm in. So, but there might be high-quality research done on situations that are somewhat similar. And so we need to generalize, which creates more uncertainty in our decision-making process. We're not certain about how exactly the research that's available relates to our particular situation. So that's lower quality. It's not as good evidence, but it's still relevant evidence. And part of the challenge for evidence-based practice is how do we use evidence that's related but not exactly on our particular problem. And then there's the whole question of lower quality. Just because a study is not the best possible study doesn't mean it's completely worthless. And so we have the challenge of how do we learn from studies that are flawed but still may yield some important directions for treatment. So this is to locate empirically supported treatment and to note how important that is, but also to note that when those are not available, I think our job in finding the best available evidence is to get into these other clouds and carefully consider what we can draw from those, at the same time recognizing there's more uncertainty. When the research is not as good methodologically and not as exactly relevant, then we have less certainty about our decisions. So there's systematic review. So going on to how do we derive, how do we find what's the best available evidence? And for identifying empirically supported treatments, there's systematic reviews, which is a kind of elaborate process that researchers have worked out for looking at evidence. But I think we need to go in the direction of alternative types of reviews to improve our ability to generalize from research that's on slightly different topics and research that's not quite as high quality. What happens with systematic reviews, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the What Works Clearinghouse, those of you who are in education probably are. What often happens is that there are 500 studies have been done in a particular area, and the What Works Clearinghouse has their standards for quality, and they consider 5 of those studies. Literally 1% is not unusual for the What Works Clearinghouse. Their bar is such for considering evidence that most of it is excluded and never even considered because of methodological problems. So I think, and often what they come up with, the answer the What Works Clearinghouse gives after their elaborate review with very high quality and so on is, we don't know enough. Okay. That's valuable to know we don't have a definitive answer. But it would also be nice to know, so did those 500 studies tell us anything? Can we make some tentative assumptions based on all of those? Or are we really at square zero? And for the most part, we're not at square zero. But these kind of formal reviews have a hard time or aren't set up to glean evidence from those kinds of studies. So we need alternative types of reviews. There's systematic reviews that I was just talking about that identify empirically supported treatments, and they have very rigorous, formalized methods. There's practice guides, which is another technique for coming up with what does the research tell us. There's best practice panels. There are narrative reviews. These are all different review methods that have their own strengths and weaknesses. And if you want to hear about the details of that, come to my breakout session later. We can get into the gory details. And while there's a lot of reasons why systematic reviews are considered the highest quality, as I said, they're not good at identifying generalizations from evidence that's suggestive rather than being definitive. And these other methods are better at that, although they have their own problems, mostly having to do with potential bias. The other way we could glean more direction for people who are actually practicing from imperfect research base is by looking at other units of practice. Typically when we talk about empirically supported treatments, those are like educational programs or packages. But we can also look at smaller units. Rather than an entire multi-component package, we can look at the components of that and validate those, see how effective those are, and use those in practice. Again, there's a continuum. There are very comprehensive school-wide systems or system-wide approaches, such as PBIS and RTI. Those are very broad. Those are broader than we usually talk about when we talk about empirically supported treatments. And then there's multi-component programs, things like an instructional program that are typically the target of empirically supported treatments. And that's great. There's a lot of reasons why talking at that level is very, very powerful. But also, there's components of those. So rather than, for example, in reading, if we don't have the evidence to support an entire reading program, can we talk about components like, if you give the kids more opportunities to read, that's a better thing. And if you give them corrections, that's even better. And if you systematically teach phonics, that's a good thing, and so on and so on. So if these components of an overall package are validated, those can give us a lot more flexibility to use the best available evidence in more educational and decisions. And then finally, there's principles of learning and behavior that can be applied in many, many situations. So this kind of continuum gives us a lot more ability to bring the best research evidence to bear on individual cases. It's not limited to those few cases where a multi-component program is empirically supported. And finally, in terms of pushing out beyond this small window of situations, progress monitoring is the most relevant evidence about what works in any case. So whether the research evidence is strong or not, progress monitoring is always there to tell us how effective a particular intervention is in a particular case, and an important part of evidence-based practice. So that's the best available evidence. What I've tried to do is suggest that the best available evidence is not just what comes in the form of empirically supported treatments, what comes from super high quality studies, but there's an entire continuum of evidence, and we need to use as much of it as possible, as well as there are formal packages and programs that can be very valuable, and there's also other ways of identifying what's effective. Now to look at client values and context, because the best available evidence is not sufficient to select a treatment. We have to know what we're trying to accomplish. Effectiveness requires consideration of values. Values meaning, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we about? And that's what I tried to touch on a little bit right at the beginning of the importance of our work and what are our most important outcomes. And then the context. What treatment is most likely to be effective in this particular context? You could have two treatments, one of which has been shown to be more effective in research studies. But if there are reasons why it can't be effectively implemented in our particular context, the effectiveness in that research study is not quite relevant. Right? What we need to know about is how effective will it be here in this particular situation with this particular students. And sometimes that's a little different than what was shown in research studies. So as I mentioned, values determine what goals are worth pursuing, what procedures are acceptable, and what level of performance is sufficient. When do we declare victory? When do we say that's good enough and we can move on to something else? And clients is a little different in education. In psychology, you know, so much work is one-on-one, and it's somewhat easier to define client. But for us, I think it starts with a broader community, because all of our work in disability fields really is done because the broader community values the kinds of things we do. As well as if we're in a school system, then there's a whole cascade from state to district to building to teacher that are clients that we have to consider, as well as specific families, especially if we're working in a more one-on-one situation. So there's a whole range of clients. And then there's contextual issues. Resources to implement a treatment, existing staffing skills, So if we don't have the staff, we don't have the skills to implement a particular treatment, that's important in this decision-making process. Do we have the training and coaching resources to bring our staff up to speed on something they don't already know how to do? Do we have the finances to purchase the program, do the training, train the trainers, and so on? Another aspect of context is compatibility with existing systems and programs. So sometimes a program will fit nicely within the context of what we already do. Other times, to use a different program, we would have to change a lot of other aspects of the system. The bottom line is it's effectiveness as implemented and as sustained that we're interested in. So we have to think about those implementation and sustaining the practice issues. Finally, professional judgment. Professional judgment is sometimes represented as kind of a third contributor to decisions in evidence-based practice, but I think it's better thought of actually as the place where the decisions get made. We have all we know about our clients and students and the context and the values and so on, and we have all the research evidence that we can glean. Those come together in some professional or set of professionals who are going to make a decision. And evidence-based practice framework provides a structure for thinking about problem solving. And how can we do problem solving that includes the best available evidence as well as these other elements? And here's an overall decision-making model that actually is a diagram that Trina developed originally, and I think really well, it is really good for talking about these issues. I'm going to look at this piece by piece because it's so complicated. First, I'm going to start off with a practical question and client values and context. So any problem we're trying to solve, we define that as a problem. And it's a problem that's defined partly by the context we're working in and the client values that determine what we're trying to do. So let's say we have a simple reading situation where a student isn't reading well. There's professional judgment that's required to decide that that's a problem that needs to be solved. Which students am I going to do problem solving with? And that has to take place in the context of larger values. So right from the very beginning of deciding that something is a problem that needs to be solved involves professional judgment. By the way, the little circle with the hash mark in it, that represents professional judgment. Professional judgment is how client values and practical questions come together. And then those two things get integrated with best available evidence. So deciding what is the best available evidence for this situation is full of professional judgment. The professional has to judge what are the sources and levels, sources of evidence and levels of treatment that we're going to look at. Professional judgment is also important for deciding on and selecting a treatment. So it's the professional that needs to weigh all the evidence and everything we know about the context to select the treatment. Right? Only a person can bring that together and decide what should be done. Professional judgment is also critical for adapting treatments to specific situations. Because rarely in our situations can we take some kind of a package, program, some kind of a existing thing, and simply implement it. But it requires a lot of judgments about how is it going to be localized to our situation. That requires professional judgment. Continuing with the process of solving problems, then implementing the treatments. Throughout the implementation process, there's lots and lots of situations where professional judgment is needed. And finally, deciding if outcomes are sufficient or do we need to cycle through again based on progress monitoring and make some more decisions. So the point here of this diagram, the big point, is there are those little circles with those hash marks in it everywhere. Professional judgment is everywhere in the evidence-based practice problem-solving model. Right? Also, best available evidence is coming in everywhere. And it's always mediated by professional judgment. Somebody always has to look at what is the best available evidence for this part of the problem-solving process and decide how does that affect us here and now. So educators and all of us professionals use professional judgment every day. Professional judgments are a necessary part of the educational decision-making process. And this pervasiveness of professional judgment suggests that we should look at it and recognize it. The reason I'm kind of harping on this a little bit is sometimes evidence-based practice is presented as kind of an alternative to professional judgment. There'll be this list of treatments, and professionals should be made to select off this list in a way that undermines professional judgment. And that's one of the things that I think could be very damaging if that view of evidence-based practice is taken forward. Simply because it won't work, because you can't do it that way, right? Our clients are too complicated to just have a list of treatments and suppose that there's a kind of mechanical way of linking treatments to clients. That we have to look at at the professional judgment piece and make sure it's working well, rather than kind of ignoring it or trying to push it aside. But professional judgment does not mean that anything goes. It's just the opposite of that. Professional judgment needs to be a very disciplined and accountable process that includes logic, it includes collaboration, it includes the use of principles of learning and behavior so that we can make judgments sensibly in areas where we don't have specific research to guide us. And it involves the use of progress monitoring, close and continual contact with the relevant outcome data. So professional judgment is very far from anything goes. And I think we need to kind of work both sides of that to recognize that it's important and that's got to be a part of the process, but also it's got to be accountable. It can't be an alternative to best available evidence. It has to be the conduit through which best available evidence is applied to particular situations. So in conclusion, evidence-based practice is the decision-making process that integrates the best available evidence, including but not limited to empirically supported treatments, client values and context, and professional judgment. All these three parts have to be part of it to really have the impact it can have. And I say this as somebody who's for a long time been very concerned about the research to practice gap. My main agenda is getting research into all of our professional work. But if we only look at the research side, that's not going to do the job. So my take is the way to close the research to practice gap, to bring research into our professional practice, is to look at client values and context and professional judgment and figure out how do these things come together. Because if research is looked at in isolation, it's not going to be effective and it could be destructive. So evidence-based practice should be pervasive. It should be applied to all of our professional decisions, to our entire professional practice. So I think evidence-based practice is our best hope for reducing the research to practice gap and improving critical outcomes. And there are just not many activities that I think are more important than improving the kind of outcomes that we are involved with. And so that's why I was very excited to come here and talk at the conference, because I think that the work that you and all of us are doing is so important. And if we can successfully infuse this three-part evidence-based practice approach to bring more research into our professional practice, that can really affect the lives of our clients. And it goes back to where I started. That's important stuff. So I think I'll end there and have you actually learn about actual practices in all the other sessions. So thanks. Yeah. So we do have a few minutes. Are there questions or discussion or shoutbacks? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Okay, the question was about accountability and how does it, I think the general point was, how does accountability work into this evidence-based practice framework? Is that fair? And there's two ways I could hear accountability. One being accountability in terms of outcomes, and the other being accountability in terms of decisions and doing the process. Were you focused on more one than the other? Right. Yeah. Um, Accountability, as in external monitoring of our outcomes, I think is a very, very powerful tool to keep us the best we can be, to make sure we are all on our game all the time. At the same time, the stronger the accountability, the stronger the consequences for accountability, the more the measure of outcomes has to be spot on. Because if the measure of outcomes is not quite right in accountability, then you get all kinds of unintended consequences. Right? Then you get narrow teaching. If we have strong accountability, but only on a few pinpoints, then you get, you are all in the field, so you know about the unintended consequences of strong accountability. But I have to say, it's a different game now than it was when I was teaching 30 years ago, and when I was at University of Washington, and up till about 10 years ago, when I would talk about what's the research on how we can teach kids effectively, how we can teach reading effectively, there wasn't necessarily a real passion for what is really most effective. Other issues were relatively important compared to that. Other issues of what I like to do, how we've always done it, and things like that. And since accountability has increased in education, there's a lot more interest in effectiveness. So I think one big take on accountability is evidence-based practice can be an answer to the question of what do we do about accountability. If we have to produce outcomes, well, a good way would be to find out what's the best available evidence and look at client values and context and put that in a decision-making process so we're sure we're using that best available evidence in the most effective way possible. So I guess I view evidence-based practice and accountability as distinct issues, but that there's a relationship between the two. I have to say, hard as this world is, there's a lot more interest in outcomes now than there was 10 or 20 years ago. And I am also aware that there's also a lot of misplaced effort and a lot of unintended, not so great consequences. The other thing is, the other part of accountability is, I mentioned very briefly, accountability for professional judgment. And I think that's something that we could really work on. That's something where we want to honor professional judgment as professional. And so when we are ourselves or people who are working with us, working for us, are engaged in evidence-based practice, I think we should be accountable for explaining our decision-making process. So when you chose this program, what was the best available evidence that you found? And how exactly were you conceptualizing the values? What were you trying to accomplish? What contextual factors did you think about? Did you take into account that you have these training resources or you don't have financial resources? How did that all come together? That was one part in evidence-based practice in psychology that APA caught onto, and it wasn't really highly emphasized, but it was there. It was being able to explain why we make the decisions we make. So I think that was another aspect of accountability that I think we could pay more attention to, because that professional judgment is key to making this work. And it's not going to be an easy part. Other comments, questions? Yes?
So I just think the last thing you said there
I hope everybody could hear that. Could everybody hear? Good, good. Mostly because there was some compliments at the beginning. I wanted you to hear that. The rest of it, yeah. No, it's a great point. It's a great point that if it goes wrong, one way this whole thing could go wrong is professional judgment becomes the loophole through which everything goes, and professional judgment becomes anything goes. I can do anything because I'm a professional, and that's just how I see it. And that would be disastrous, right? That would be, it would undermine the entire thing, because then the other two parts of the system aren't working, right? Because then the best available evidence is irrelevant. And even client values and context could become irrelevant, right? So if any part of this three-part system dominates to the exclusion of the others, it just can't work. And again, I'm not saying that as a moral statement that I want to value professionals as professionals, although I do. That's not really where I'm coming from. It's that it needs to be there so the system can work, because primarily I want outcomes, right? So, but how do we control it? How do we keep that from becoming the loophole that not quite the right metaphor here, the end that unravels the entire sweater, right? That's a great question. And I think that's one of the next places we need to go in developing evidence-based practice in our area. I don't have a worked out slide on that, but I think the direction that we need to go are two directions we need to go are two. One is, I think professional development, what I do at the university of training new teachers, and BCBA programs and other rehab counseling programs and so on, need to be very clear about a lot of what they're doing is developing professional judgment. And they're developing the ability to then, once the student graduates, to continue to learn throughout their career. And professional judgment is comes from a combination of what we do in training, hopefully, and years of bumping up against lots of kids, lots of adults, lots of systems, and being shaped by all those contingencies, right? It's partly the university professor, and it's partly Marcus Welby, the great clinician who is so wise. And you don't really know why. It's just part of him, right? So one part is training well. But I think we need to, in our organizations, we need to develop some kind of a framework, an explicit framework, the kind of thing I was mentioning before, and here I'm brainstorming with you. But why not have a formal process of, this was an important decision. It's one that we are committed to as an organization that's committed to evidence-based practice. And let's talk about it. Have we done evidence-based practice, or are we doing it now? And maybe we come up with a structured way of talking about that, maybe starting from the top, as you suggested, starting from modeling this at, my level. Am I in my program at Utah State for preparing special ed teachers, are we doing evidence-based practice? Let's hold ourselves accountable for that process. Or maybe I'm using professional judgment kind of to take the easy way out. And then I would think people who run agencies could do that and model it for their leadership and on down. But I think you're absolutely right that professional judgment is necessary and dangerous. This is great. Somebody else have ideas based on this? Or another direction? Yes, please. Yeah, it is. They're all huge systems. One thing which I want to say right off is a point I made about what I think is one of the key things for problem solving, which is focus on the variables that we can control. And I can't control what my dean does very well. I mean, I can advocate, and actually I have a very good dean, so to some extent I can. But we all work within larger social, political frameworks that we can maybe influence a little bit, nudge politically, but for the most part, I think that getting too focused on that might prevent us from looking at the level at which we do have control. So in terms of the big ship, that's why I was kind of amazed at the group here. There's a lot of pieces of that ship sitting right in this room. And at different levels, as I understand from Trina, that if each of us were working at the level that we are in the system, a lot of those pieces would connect up. One thing I've thought about in my education, special education world, is we at the university often say, behind closed doors, we do such a great job training these teachers, and they go out to school districts where good practices are not valued, and we go out and we see them later, and they're not doing it anymore. And a good friend of mine is the special ed director in our local school district. And sometimes he'll be honest enough, he's always honest, he'll be unguarded enough to say, you know, we do so much professional development in the school district, it would be really nice if teachers came in knowing something. And it would be possible for each of us to get very frustrated with the other parts of the system not working very well. And I think if each of us do our part as well as it can, it creates the context for other parts working better. So if I keep putting out the very best brand new first year, wet behind the ear special ed teachers I can, then any district that is trying to implement evidence-based practice will have a better shot if they hire some of those teachers. And if they keep working with whoever they get and establish systems, part of their context are the kinds of teachers they get, and work with that, then any teachers that I prepare that are actually very effective coming in will have a good context for practice. So part of my answer is we've all got to do our parts, but trying to, this is where maybe the turn the ship metaphor is problematic, because it's not one ship, it's a whole bunch of it's a flotilla of boats, right? And so we each need to turn our little boat, and of course there are some big ships that could run over us. But there's a one here, and then I'll go over there, and then I'll go back here. Right. Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. And that's what I was maybe obliquely referring to in terms of accountability can be a very powerful thing, but if it's not the right measure, it can create these unintended consequences. So one I just ran into is IEPs are very important, as we all know, and a school was reviewed on their IEPs, and they used the wrong word for some particular thing. It was, instead of outcome, they said measure. And that was noted, and they were demerited for this. Rather than looking at, are the kids learning anything here? You know, anything valuable? So we have to be very careful about accountability and getting it just right. But then that's part of our context, right? Part of my context is some silliness that I have to spend time in meetings, and I have to go through the similar thing at the university level where we have to make sure all of our courses are aligned with all these standards and so on. Okay, that's part of the context within which I'm going to have to see how can I implement this. There was a hand over here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, very good. And that relates very nicely to the question of professional judgment, holding each other accountable. Yeah, yeah. There was a hand over here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great, great point about mentorship. And it's another one, like professional judgment, that can cut both ways. Because new professionals are socialized into the system one way or another. Right? That's going to happen. It's kind of like professional judgment. It's impossible to get along without it. But it could enforce the way we've always done things, or it could be a change mechanism. And so I think you bring up a great point of if we can be very aware of that and very proactive to make that a really strong agent of change rather than something that holds the system in place. Because as teachers come in, or professionals in whatever role come in, they're told, okay, this is the way it really works. So I think that's a great component. Dr. Spencer. Okay, one more question I hear. Anything? Okay, in that case, I'll have Trina come back up and wrap it up.
Okay, it's only 10 in the morning and I am incredibly reinforced. This was a really, really awesome discussion and exactly what I was hoping to achieve. Thank you so much, Tim. That was fantastic. And thank you so much for your questions and comments. one of the things that struck me while I was listening to your questions was really the purpose of this gathering is not to give everybody the answers. The answers are not here. They're not available. But we can establish where we're at and what we know right now. And in all the layers and all those floating devices out there, we have issues and obstacles that we still have to overcome. And I strongly believe that we can overcome those if we start talking to each other and problem solving with each other. And so I'm really excited to see some of that happening today, and that, you know, if we had all the answers, then this would be a one-hit wonder and we'd be done. But I'm quite reinforced that we have more to do, and we still have 2 days of a conference, and we're gonna get a good running start, and then we have lots to work on together in our state. I just wanted to point out that our breakout sessions are presented by invited speakers, and they've been invited because they have expertise in some area. They know the research, the evidence about a particular practice. I'm really grateful that they've accepted this invitation. Most of them are not being paid to be here, so what they're doing is contributing their expertise for the better of our state and our evidence-based practice movement here. I also wanted to point out, what's this? Oh yeah, I need to talk about lunch. So we're gonna have a break, and then we're gonna have lunch, and at lunch there is gonna be one table that is specifically like gluten-free and vegetarian. So if you have requested a special lunch, make sure you look for that particular table. Okay, I believe we're good. We have a break now, and then go into your breakout sessions. Oh, sorry, Dita's reminding me that the CRC folks, this was an approved session, so if you are getting CEUs for this one, make sure you see Dita to get your papers signed. All right, thank you.